Hi everyone. Today we have a quite interesting show. I wanted to talk about this topic for the longest time. We talk about accountability and transparency. It's a great deal because first of all, as social impact organizations, I think it fits rather nicely in a lot of our missions. And also, the idea is usually to challenge organizations, even for profits, for example, to higher standards. But also at the same time, the landscape is changing. A lot of the accountability, a lot of the transparency these days is involved in, for example, digital related laws. And the idea is how can you respect those laws yourself as a social impact organization is also a challenge. So how can we strive to go at have higher standards for everybody, including ourselves? And today, good news, it's not just me. We're lucky to have Cheri-Leigh Erasmus that is joining us. You're the Global Director of Learning, which is such an interesting title at Accountability Lab. So, Sherry, first of all, I want to know more about that specific title because the wording is quite interesting. And what got you into this?
Thank you so much for having me, Valentine. Yeah, I'm super excited to be here. What got me into this is a general interest in working in the governance space and working on accountability and anti corruption efforts. But more
Mm-hmm.
than that, creating spaces for people who are generally excluded from governance and transparency conversations to get them into those conversations. And that's what initially led me to the Accountability Lab, where I'm now serving as the Global Director of Learning. Essentially, what the role implies is that I'm responsible for both internal and external learning at the lab. What that means is internal in terms of how do we strengthen our systems and the capacity of our teams and ensure the programmatic quality of whatever interventions we bring to life at the accountability lab to foster participation and good governance. But also, how do we then measure and talk about the impact of that work?
So
And
the
so
practical side of it, basically.
absolutely. If we
I see.
say that we are using donor funding for projects in particular countries, how is that actually working? And the global piece of it is that at Accountability Lab, we're actually structured as a translocal network. So we have accountability labs across 11 countries. And then a couple of us work at Accountability Lab Global, which is essentially, I like to see us as a team that in a way weaves together the strategy and the learning and creates some processes for all of us to share across the network.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm sure we'll get to talk about this internal learning part of it, right? So we don't end up making the same mistakes. We did a few episodes on knowledge management and the importance of it. You talked about conversations. I want to bring a few steps back. I want to know, when did you start having that conversation with yourself? When did it click? What moment in your life? What did you see, or what happened that it clicked in you, and you realized that you need to have that conversation about transparency and accountability. What was that moment?
Yeah, so this is actually deeply ingrained in me. So I'm a South African and grew up a good chunk of my life in apartheid South Africa, where obviously transparency and accountability was only afforded to a particular subset of society based on race. And I think issues of accountability and transparency are so deeply linked to equity because it is all about giving everyone the same access to information, giving everyone the same rights, regardless of race, ethnicity, creed, all of those things. And so for me, that growing up in South Africa at that time, a system that was just unjust to the majority of the population, that really from a very young age created this interest in how do we create systems that are actually equitable? How do we create systems where everyone not only has the same say on this in the sense of we all get to vote, but also have the same access to information and participation in a range of processes across what makes a country and a society work.
Fantastic. So we'll cover a lot of ground together. We'll go from existing models of transparency. We'll talk about how to distribute those models, how to make it, how to use them in practice, and of course, what is the cost of having or not having those transparency measures. Of course, because it's a live show and we have an audience, it's always fantastic when we have questions from the audience. And until those pipe in, and by the way, if you're listening back home or in the office, it's Friday after all. Fairly simple. Just use your favorite chat, whatever you're on YouTube, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, and just use the chat feature. We'll get the message and we'll be able to display it on board. Feel free to challenge Cheri. That will be a good time to ask her some hard questions, and for sure we'll be able to continue that discussion. What I want to know, you know what? I have an example in mind. It's something I've seen quite recently. After all, if I ask the audience some examples or some questions, let's kick with the first question. I was in an event recently. It's an event about social impact, and there's one presentation. There basically a lot of people are presenting innovative solutions, right? And that their startup or the organization is working on. And one of them that was quite longer than usual was done by one of the participants that did not clearly identify himself as a member of the board, right? And afterwards, there was a 5 à 7, 5 to 7, kind of more social to discuss and network. And that was sponsored by the same individual and its organization. Right. Now, the event itself is a nonprofit event. The product, the solution, the innovation that person was presenting was compelling, was very relevant, but he did not disclose his affiliation as a board member of that event. I asked the question to a few people during the event. He's like, what do you think about it? Do you think there's a conflict of interest? There's a lack of transparency? And the answer I got was, well, it's a nonprofit event, so it doesn't matter. There's no money involved. You cannot have lack of transparency if there's no money involved. And now you can see Cheri is getting uncomfortable on that topic because I think it hits at a specific point. What is your perspective on an issue like that? How do you break it down?
There's never no money involved. It's just maybe you're not taking money from the general public because you're not selling a product that's widely used by ordinary people, in the case of a corporation. But, as nonprofits, all we are is really stewards of donor money. And so there is money involved. And beyond even moving away from the topic of money, there are people involved. And so I don't know exactly what the pitch was, what the intervention was they were talking about, but in any nonprofit setting, any intervention in some ways, if we're talking about social impact, surely there are people on the other end of it that will be affected by it, whether it's a
Mm-hmm.
program you're running or a tool you're introducing. And so we still owe it to whoever engages with us full transparency on who you are, even who's funding potentially a specific thing. And there is, however, Valentine, this tension between radical accountability and radical transparency, which we talk about at Accountability Lab as well. In that instance, I don't see any reason for a board member not to make themselves known as a board member, because surely those are things that for most nonprofit organizations are visible on their website anyway. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so in that case, it's a bit weird. Um, However, I do think that there are instances where you don't necessarily disclose everything about where something comes from, because the root of donor money could actually, in some ways, also put a community at risk, right? When there
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
more politically sensitive issues at play. So I think we have to just be clear about the fact that if there's no risk to a community, I see no reason not to be transparent. But if you're working with more sensitive issues, that's a different story.
So if I get it right, it's almost this idea that by default you're transparent and you don't take any chances and you disclose, unless, for example, you work with vulnerable population where some of that could constitute a problem. But if that's the case, you really have to make your case that you act in the best interest of everyone, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's about acting in the best interest of everyone all the time and making your decisions absolutely based on that.
It's interesting. I was recently looking at the GDPR kind of almost philosophy behind it in terms of what are they trying to do with those measures besides the legal side of it. GDPR, for those who are not familiar, is all those little messages that you're getting when you go on websites, and it deals a lot with private information and how it can be used. And there was this very interesting part that talks about accountability, and the way they were framing it quite clearly is that essentially, as an organization, you have to have an officer that is in charge of the data that your organization is collecting. And pretty much all organizations, you are collecting information that you have internally from the people that you interact with. It could be your community, donors, and etc. And you have to prove that you do your best with ideas of privacy by default and privacy by design, for example, to make sure that you are accountable to the best practices in terms of things like transparency and use of data. And this is quite interesting because essentially what it says is that the person, if an organization abides by those rules, let's say you're in Europe, you're a big organization, so clearly you have to follow those rules. You have to prove that you do everything that is reasonable to hold those higher standards of privacy, for example, and transparency and accountability, and that you stay in the loop in terms of that you stay in the loop in terms of what's going on in that discussion. This is quite radical in terms of using a legal text to say you now have to prove that based on the size of your organization. So if you're a small nonprofit, maybe it's a bit harder, but if you're big, you have to prove that with all those extra tools that you have access to, that you are accountable to everything that relates to, for example, privacy in your organization. This is an example we have in Europe. What do we have, for example? What kind of models we should consider legally, or in terms of, let's say, more on the admin side that we can look at that comes from, for example, North America?
So my knowledge of this is way more focused on the global south, in the sense that a lot of our program implementation takes place there, and there are different examples um, of frameworks that are similar to the European model. So you have the Poppy Act in South Africa, which also is very specific around the ways in which you must get consent from people for the use of their data, and how that data is then supposed to be stored, and what purposes you can then use that data for. So in a number of the countries where we work, we also really strictly try to follow, as best we can, of course, those frameworks. But I do also think that there's an opportunity here for organizations to hold themselves accountable internally, beyond the legal frameworks. So, for example, for me, it comes down to values, especially if we talk about ourselves as social impact organizations, and we talk about, improvement of lives, things like equity, all of those issues. Then surely we have to hold ourselves accountable for the way in which we treat people's data, and whether the mechanisms we have in place keep people safe and also recognize their dignity. Because I actually think one of the biggest challenges in the social impact sector, especially when we're working directly with people in different communities, is often that we understand the frameworks legally, and we ourselves would, call on those frameworks for our own protections. But then often data is collected in communities and shared quite widely without the right forms of consent. And that speaks to a little bit of a lack of treating people with an equitable regard for dignity, if we think about it. Because what makes your data, even if anonymized, more important than someone who might be using a social service, for example? Um, And I just think if we as social impact organizations really look at our values and how that translates in when it comes to things like data and security, then there's a lot we can even put in place internally. And that's also, I think, just on a practical level, organizations should and hopefully do all have their own data privacy and data protection policies that should also be open to anyone who partners with them or partakes in any sort of engagement with them. That I think would be the first step, because again, putting it out there that this is what we hold ourselves accountable for gives someone a framework to come back
Yep.
with and say, but actually you didn't use my data in the right way, or I didn't consent to something.
Exactly. That's the impressive things of measures like GDPR, that, for example, any big social impact organization has to abide by, because you are in Europe, you have presence there. Is that if anyone asks you, if any competent authority asks you, you have to be on request, be able to prove that you have a plan to manage those, let's say, privacy and accountability that comes with it, and etc. on request. So you basically have to do it. So if I get it right, Cheri, the good news is that for many organizations, this is already those legal requirements, as you said, are already compatible with the mission, right? It's not saying something different. It just formalizes what a lot of organizations already care about. So that's the good part. I want to go maybe a bit towards the harder part, which is setting in place those measures. Because it's legal, it's a bit more formal now than saying having those values. There's a process to follow.
Mhm.
For a lot of organizations who struggle in terms of admin, of having the resources to carry their mission forward, in practice, what do you see when organization says, okay, I agree with those values, now I have to apply them legally? Do they have the structure, do they have the maturity and the resources to actually nominate somebody to be in charge of the data, to basically do the act of the accountability itself? In practice, what does it look like?
So for me, relating this back to what we try to do at Accountability Lab, we have an understanding that even just creating a policy costs resources. Having
Hmm.
someone with a legal background is able to look over your privacy policy, or someone with real digital privacy expertise, for example, making sure that this is actually not only practical but aligns with the different existing legal structures
Hmm.
out there. All of those things cost money. And what we try to do is we take our role as an organization that's slightly further along on our development journey really seriously, in that the smaller partners we work with and the young people who come through our accountability incubator, who we help to set up their own social impact projects or organizations, we actually make our policies available open source to them so that they can adapt
Nice.
them, and so that they don't have to go and pay, the same legal fees to get this
Hmm.
drafted and spend the man hours. And I want to challenge organizations out there who are in a position to do this to go ahead and do that, because there's no reason we should that 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 others can't make use of this, because it makes the sector stronger, if we
Hmm.
are sharing these things. And you're absolutely right. Being accountable, being transparent, it comes at a cost, especially based on the communities where we work. So if we talk a little bit about the digital divide, for example, having having people understand how you work and why you work in a certain way online does not mean that everyone who engages with your work actually has access to it. So, in the
Hmm.
case of Accountability Lab, where we work in countries like Somaliland, Zimbabwe, many other countries where, especially in rural parts, people have limited access to data, it means that we have to find lower tech ways to engage with communities, and also in that way ensure that they understand, if they give us their data, what they're consenting to. So that often means going back to paper-based, printed, here is what we're going to do with your data, like sticking up posters that say that if you're coming to this event, are you willing to consent to us using your picture? All of those ways in which things like privacy and transparency also intersect with safeguarding is really for us at the heart of the matter. And we have to find ways to also cross the digital divide to essentially give people the agency to hold us accountable because they know what we're doing and what we're meant to be doing. And if that is just putting a policy online, and thinking that, well, everyone can see our policy out there, then actually that's not being accountable.
This is very interesting and fairly deep because essentially we go from the idea we have values, but good news, you don't have to restart from scratch and writing a document. There's a base that you can use and that you're sharing for free, which is absolutely fantastic. We need more of that collaboration. But the idea from there is then to share it regardless of from the most technical side to the more, and let's face it, when you're in the field at Grey Blocks, we work on projects that in areas where there's literally no internet connectivity. So you really have to adapt to a whole broad area of use cases. It directly comes to accessibility. And then, if I get it right, you can use that as saying, don't worry, yes, it's a bit of work to show those things, but it helps you to ultimately create transparency and trust, right?
Absolutely.
And if the cost of accountability allows you to gain more trust and to be accountable to your community so they can hold you to a higher standard, it really sets an interesting dynamic. I think that is very, very interesting. I think we had a question from Dennis. Dennis, I know something is sticking, and you want to ask something. You see, Sherry, this smile. This is the smile of a man who has a question
I'm
burning
concerned.
behind his. Go ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, I love the conversation about the accountability and also resources for nonprofits because I've had my hands on a couple of nonprofits. I've seen the inner workings, and I'm very curious to ask you about how do organizations continue to stay accountable and responsible when technology moves and changes so rapidly, especially for the smaller ones that are trying to keep up. What's a reasonable expectation for them in order to be able to implement good practices, stick with them, adapt as technology changes? Because something that kind of comes to mind is that we look at organizations such as the government, for example, like one of the biggest bureaucracies, the tons of people working, tons of people doing stuff, and they are not keeping up with good practices necessarily a lot of the time. Like they're far, far behind in terms of keeping up with what technology offers and provides. How do we expect smaller organizations and nonprofits to keep up as well and be responsible? Or what does a picture of responsibility looks like for smaller organizations?
I think for me, it's about sticking to the basics. And that's a very big question, Dennis. But I can't imagine a nonprofit organization, especially who's able to keep up with everything. But if we keep up with the basics, such as consent, such as being responsive and responsible when collecting data, even if it's, you know, most organizations can't afford a very technologically advanced, even knowledge management system. So it means that even if you're just doing this in Google spreadsheets, make sure that you control access to those things, right? I think it's more important to get the very basic things right that your staff are already doing instead of aiming so high that you create an unattainable ceiling for yourself that you're just not going to be able to do it because at the end of the day, um, as was pointed out earlier as well, even certain positions, like having someone just be their full time job is data management and those sort of things, I know very little organizations who, in the first however many years of their existence, can afford that. But what I will also say is if organizations are really committed to this, and if they get the basics right in terms of just ensuring that they are transparent, they're accountable, and they really preserve the rights of others, then I also think they should I think we should speak up as social impact organizations when it comes to donor funding. I think we should make efforts to also say that, look, as an organization, we really want to prioritize X. We really want to be accountable in the following ways. And that will cost X number of man hours. and these technological tools that come with subscriptions or purchases or whatever. And we need to start building this into our proposals, and we need to start having these conversations, because I think um, it's not good enough for us to say that it comes at a cost if we're also not pushing that and quantifying it to the people who, in very many ways, can help us overcome the stumbling block that is costs and resources.
There's
That's
maybe a bit of a good news here too. I think previously I mentioned the philosophy of the that legal measure that is pushing in US, the General Data Protection Regulation, the famous GDPR. There's equivalent, by the way, in California, the CCPA. Not too different in terms of philosophy, but for this one, they actually don't tell you how private your data needs to be. They don't set an exact number or certification or etc. So then you're like, okay, what is the fuzz about? What they say is that you have to prove that you did your due diligence, accounting for uh, the size and the resources of your organizations,
Mhm.
right? So that means that can you at least, even if you're a small organization, can you at least prove that you did the training, right? That you sent somebody from the team doing a training about those issues, and that, for example, as Cheri mentioned, you use existing documentation, you implemented that in your next project, at least some elements. Of course, you won't be able to do it very complex, but can you prove it at least at the scale you're at, you did your part? And this is crazy because essentially, if you're a huge organization and you have more control over what you do, your standards is higher, and that person, for example, in this case, you need to formalize it that one person in the organization is the point of contact with that, and the government can ask them, can you prove, do you have papers right now when I'm asking that you've done it? It's that concrete, right? But what do you show them is basically related to the level of what you can deliver as an organization. So they don't specify it in detail, but they give a very clear tone, I think, of you cannot say, I'm too small, I cannot
Right.
afford to think about accountability. They will not challenge you on your size. They will challenge you on what you can do, and you have to prove that you did what is reasonable at your at your scale. This is pretty deep as far as law goes. This is interesting. Cheri, you mentioned about few models that could be used. Let's get practical here. Let's say I'm a young organization and I want to get a better sense of, okay, I hear you. It's important. There's tools, but what does it look like? Is there sites or models that you usually like to refer, point people towards?
Yeah. So first of all, let me start off by saying that as an organization, this is also like, I think it should be a learning moment where we think what is possible for us in terms of accountability and transparency. So, one very practical, relatively simple thing to do, because you can do it in a format that's affordable for your organization, is visualizing your annual budget online, for example. That's a very transparent way. It means that people who engage with you, whether it's donors or partners or communities on the ground, um, can in some way find access to what you are, how you as an organization are prioritizing your money. And again, there are more high level tools for this, but I think just even making it accessible in a basic table format on your website is something that most any organization can do. And you can decide on the level of specificity that's in there. Now, if we go a little bit to a deeper sense of accountability in terms of how do organizations that are maybe a little bit further along on their development journey, who have some foundations in place, who have a little bit of resources, how can we hold ourselves accountable? There's actually principles one could sign up to through an organization called Accountable Now. Um, and what Accountable Now has done over the last few years is come up essentially with 12 principles that constitute that make up practices that an organization that would call themselves radically or dynamically accountable should be able to measure and see present in their work. And those principles would be things like justice and equity, gender equality, a healthy planet. So, how we implement our processes and how we use tools in a way that ensures that, like, we're contributing to a healthy planet and lasting positive change. So, are we doing things in a way that is sustainable? There's also approaches that are built on people driven work. So, are we co creating things in partnership with others? How are we advocating for fundamental changes and open organizations? And so there's really these 12 different principles that organizations who sign up as members of Accountable Now report on an annual basis. So you go through a process internally of measuring your own performance, your own policies, and your own engagement with others based on these principles. And it's not meant as a let's catch each other out mechanism, but rather a way for you to have a bit of a rubric against which you can measure yourself so that at the end of the day you come away realizing, yikes, now that we've looked at all of our programs, we're maybe really fumbling a little bit on gender equality. And we need to really, in the next year, make a concerted effort um, to make sure that we include more, to have a more diverse gender pool in our programming. Or maybe some of our practices aren't really contributing to a healthy planet in some way, if that's something that's cool, if there's ways in which your work could contribute to emissions or many other things. So I personally like the idea of holding yourself accountable, and then those reports get made public so that you're also radically accountable to your stakeholders and to the world at large around what you are still struggling on.
This is fantastic because it's the organization accountable now. If I get it right, get started there. Take a look at that list and not only use it internally, but when it comes to that for your next project, when you apply for funding, you can already start that discussion internally and even get rewarded ultimately, because I assume that this gives an organization that's a young organization a significant advantage when they can prove that a project is accountable to those various elements, right? Is that something that you see where organizations that do this homework, let's say, it makes it easier for them to look funding and support in the future?
Well, and there's a number of things that intersect with that, Valentine, and it's really about you did the homework. And so the fact that this is out there, that you've completed this process, I think does give some credibility that you're walking the walk, especially if if your values are built around accountability and all of these different things. And I think that instantly, builds trust as well with donors and others. Um, but secondly, I actually think that this whole process of on an annual basis rating yourself against these
Hmm.
things is such an amazing internal learning process that ultimately makes your proposal writing, makes your report writing, even all of those things a lot easier. It gives life to what you're trying to achieve in the world around accountability, and that's incredibly useful because we learn so much from just having these conversations annually.
It's fantastic because naturally, maybe a bit less on small organizations, but definitely true on bigger organizations or collectives of small organizations. Everybody have usually more specific orientations or values that they care more about, which of course naturally doesn't diminish any other values, but this is usually more closer to their home mission. And by looking at those things, by explicit the discussion and the conversation and the accountability, we basically have that conversation internally and then are also able to have that conversation with other people and other organizations, but also organizations that can fund and support the project as well. This is quite interesting. Is that kind of one of the vehicle that you'll use to have this kind of more horizontal accountability across the organization, that kind of conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important for us as social impact organizations to hold each other accountable more than anything. And I'm going to bring it back to the little story you shared about being at the event a couple of weeks ago.
Mhm.
The comment that someone made around, it's a nonprofit organization, it's okay. I think,
They don't have to disclose everything. There's no
right.
money.
It's
Hmm.
almost like we're all good here. However, I think that idea that we're doing good work in the world at, whether it's true or not, um, often gives social impact organizations a bit of a veneer under which we
Hmm.
hide with a lot of different things. So it's like because we're doing good, surely, you don't question like our ethics or that we're
Hmm.
transparent or that we're accountable. And there's so many problems around that, and in a sense that just the fact that you're a social impact organization in and of itself does not give you credibility, and it should not give you any sort of veneer. We should
Hmm.
still be questioning each other, um, internally, and in the sector. And I don't mean this as a bad calling each other out situation, but rather that we
We
make
call this a use case. It's a fantastic way to rewrite the narrative around that. It's not a bad example. It's a use case that
right,
we can.
excellent use case. But it is about saying that if organizations like us, who often are trying to hold governments accountable or trying to hold whoever is in power, whether it's we're trying to hold a corporation accountable for something, whatever it is that you're doing, um, if we want to have credibility for that vertical accountability that we expect from people in power, then we can't really walk the walk without having
Mhm.
horizontal accountability in our ecosystem, right? And so that's something I feel incredibly strongly about, that we make we make our ecosystem stronger by strengthening our own fabric, by building in this accountability, and also saying to each other that, this is not necessarily good enough. Or at Accountability Lab, we take a more positive deviance approach to everything, which is rather, how can we model better? Like, how do we highlight the examples of good practice, without having to focus on what's not working?
And this is a fantastic way of thinking, because essentially you're moving out of a logic of a marketing kind of control, where we did a project and some stuff worked, some stuff didn't work, and we only gonna put the positive spin on it. You basically set yourself through that transparency and accountability model to allow people to question you, but also to be in a position where you can transparently say, look, we're good at this, we're not so good at this,
Mhm.
we're just a 10 people organization, right? But
Right.
we set up those structure in place, and it will take us longer to get better at this because we cannot do everything, but at least you're having that conversation, right?
Absolutely. And I actually think one of the biggest things to model in terms of accountability in an organization internally as well, on a very practical level, and it costs you almost nothing, is just modeling that failure is okay. And
Hmm.
so at Accountability Lab, we actually regularly host things like fail fairs, where it's not only people from us internally that would be invited, but also other nonprofits who are at the same space of development and also trying to make change in the same places and communities that we're trying to work in. And people just exchange failures and how they're now trying to rectify those things. And I think modeling that is also an important piece, because if you are in a sector the way we are, where you know you're going to live or die by getting your next cycle of grant funding, then obviously that incentivizes only showing the good things,
Hmm.
because at the end of the day, that's what you're in a way selling.
Hmm.
However, I think if we also say, which increasingly organizations do, that we're focused on learning, then that learning should include the things that don't work, and we should get comfortable and and model at a high level that that failure is also okay. And donors should also get comfortable seeing that things don't always go the right way. And I'm not saying, just absolutely make a mess of things with a total disregard for how you're using money. But I am saying that I can't think of an organization that hasn't failed on some project.
Yeah, and you have case of emergencies, for example, if you have to act in a specific area, in the context of emergency, you will by design prioritize some stuff over other elements, you know. And if you
Absolutely.
accept that you're a bit more wasteful in some areas, uh, that's one thing, but can you disclose it and explain why you made that decision? So if I get it right, essentially, there are ethical reasons to do it. There's legal background more and more. There's frameworks to be able to make sure that you apply that in organizations. There's frameworks that are adapted or how complex you can afford or you want to go in some of those elements. Of course, if you work on a project that requires absolute privacy um, because people's life could be at stake, let's say in totalitarian regimes, for example, you have to do way more in that area than some other organizations that don't have those issues. Time is running quickly. I just want to ask, what is an example of a cost that you can think of an organization not going through those steps? We talked about it takes time. There's a cost of in terms of time, resources, communication, and etc. But what is the cost of not doing any of that you've seen, and maybe what is one opportunity that is suddenly open when you do this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are so many costs when you don't do the right thing, but maybe it's just because I'm acting from a place of values in a way. When I think about it at our organization, the cost is that just that you're not being true to the people you're working with if you don't have a regard for things like their privacy and if you're not accountable to them. And so for me, the cost can ultimately be your organization's reputation, because we've
Mm-hmm.
seen many organizations, whether has been around safeguarding issues with vulnerable groups that can, be extreme in terms of like physical harm to people, but can also be um, more silent in the sense of just people's data floating out there, as you said, in countries um, that have difficult regimes where you could literally be at risk. The cost could be having program participants who shouldn't be participating in anti-corruption type programming or advocacy type work um, in politically tense countries. The cost could be them ending up in jail or even losing their lives. Right. So the human cost of being accountable with the resources we have and with the data we have can be immense. And I don't think we stress that enough. And obviously, based on your organization size and the type of work you do, the stakes can be lower or higher. But I think, regardless of the stakes, we should walk the walk anyway. And I think
Exactly.
much as though the cost is your reputation, the safety and livelihoods of others. The benefit is also just being seen as an organization who's a partner who cares about others, who people will continue to engage with and participate in programming or make use of your tools because they know that they can rely on you. And if, as a social impact change maker, um, we want to build trust, then we need to convey to people that we take that trust seriously too. And as I said again, like being transparent and walking the walk and being able to convey that to people who are interested in supporting your work definitely has a direct impact in terms of the credibility and respect people have for you and how that translates into resources and support coming your way.
This is pretty meaningful in the sense that the cost, what you end up losing if you don't allow yourself as an organization to be transparent, is not just a grant or a project. Is literally the reason of being of the organization. The mission and the vision itself can start to diverge in ways that is really hard to see because you don't allow people to be even able to criticize you or to comment or to ask questions. And the other side, flip side of that coin, is that what you can gain is actually that transparency, that trust that allows you to do what you do, the reason why you created the organization in the first place. So it's not just a nice to have. It's ultimately, when you think of it, one of the few ways that you can control and make sure that you stay aligned with the reason why you created the organization in the first place,
A
is by
hundred
being
percent.
accountable and transparent. That's like the one way that you can keep an eye on it, not just yourself, but thanks to a group of people around you as well. Is that a safe recap of that conversation?
Definitely. It's definitely not a nice to have. Like for me, it would be hard to imagine working in an organization where I'm not 100% sure that they are staying true to the mission in this way as well. Um, so yeah, it's really everything. It's that,
Hmm.
how it's about how quickly you can literally lose your reputation as an organization, and especially if you're a small organization. I think, there have been some bigger scandals with large organizations over the years, international INGOs, and they bounce back because they have a body of work and they have
Hmm.
political capital and all sorts of things. But if you're small, um, the stakes are actually higher because we can't lose our reputation. For it's often all we have in
Hmm.
the beginning.
And in some ways, it's even easier when you're a small organization to start thinking about those things early on. We mentioned, I think, previously, for example, privacy by design. It costs you less, literally, in terms of time and energy, to think about those things at an organization of 3 people than an organization of 300 people, where it becomes increasingly complicated. So I hope this is a message of a positive message, that we end up saying, even if you're a small organization, now is a fantastic time to jump on. It will safeguard your culture, the reason why you created the organization, and now is the best time to jump on that ship. And that, as you said, Cheri, there's a lot of resources. I'm sure some people will be curious to know more. Cheri, if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do so? And also, is there a little last resource, or link that you want to share on the way out as well?
Yeah, I'm happy to share my email address if you want to pop that on the screen. I'll pop it in the chat here quickly. People are more than welcome to reach out to me. Um, And yeah, we have a number of tools and things on the Accountability Lab website as well that organizations can look at. We have blog pieces written up about our own accountability. And thanks for also pulling up the resources from Accountable Now that I mentioned earlier. Um, these are the 12 principles that should guide your organization in terms of dynamic accountability. And even maybe if you're not at a space right now where your organization, has the bandwidth or the resources to sign up and commit to doing something like this annually, I encourage you to just go on the Accountable Now website, familiarize yourself with those 12 principles, and read up. They have a ton of resources there around dynamic accountability, because you can, from, again, as you said, if you're a small 3-person organization, it might even be the best time to start building those principles into what you're doing now and to build it up from scratch, right? And maybe at a later time, you're at a better place to make a formal commitment to publishing your reports and becoming a fully fledged member of Accountable Now in that sense.
Fantastic, Sherry. I really enjoyed that conversation. I think for people who are curious, who want to strive for higher accountability measures. Sorry, who wants to strike and make sure that they stay aligned with their values, and that they keep an eye on what's going on. How can they make themselves and their organization better? This is a fantastic and yet extremely practical way to get started. Sherry, thank you for taking your time today. It's Friday. We all filled with work. Thank you for taking a bit of time talking about something that is very important. I think accountability and transparency is a fantastic way for an organization to get meaningful conversation going on within the organization and also outside. After all, it's all about that. Thank you so much, Sherry. And of course, for viewers, if you have questions and you watch the show after it's been live, feel free to write them in the chat. Our team will intercept that and we'll put you in touch with the right people. So thank you, Sherry.
Thank you so much for having me.
Fantastic. And just before we go for our viewers, Dennis, if you can put on full screen, fantastic. We have a few more episodes coming up. We were quite busy with a lot of our projects, but fear not, we'll talk about social innovation and the impact of technologies when it comes to their social impact, essentially. So, when we talk about social technologies, yes, technologies have a tremendous amount of impact when you spend 8 hours a day in front of a computer or when you use them in your organizations. We'll have other discussions related to transparency, best practices in an organization. We'll also talk about how to manage a remote team. A lot of organizations right now that the COVID is slowly ending, I think we can safely say that the worst is probably behind us. Now it's all about how can we keep those teams that are remote and at the same time keep that culture and keep that those meaningful interactions. So all kind of discussions related to social impact and the best way to do it. If you have any questions or ideas for topics, or if you want to be in the show, very simple. Find your favorite social media, get in touch with us. That's it for me. Have a great weekend. Ciao, ciao, folks.